What's up, everybody? I'm David Hain. Welcome to episode 269 of the A2D From Addict to Disciple podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, follow, and share the link with your friends. If you'd like to get our curriculum, you can get the paperback or ebook of From Ashes to Destiny on Amazon. Today's episode, number 269, is entitled Healthy Boundaries. And I want to give a big welcome to my friends in recovery from the US, South Africa, and Australia for their participation in this group. As before, I'll be keeping them anonymous, but I'll be saying their answers as if we're having a live group meeting. And I really enjoy doing these groups and glad I get the positive feedback from the listeners that you enjoy them too, because I get to ask a question and see what they think about it. And you as listeners get to hear not just my opinion on the topic, but another half a dozen guys giving their opinion, all of them successful in recovery. So here's the question for today's podcast episode. Therapists and psychologists often teach people to set healthy boundaries, but I often find that these don't work with addicts. The problem with healthy boundaries is the addict or recovering addict may feel they're unjust, unfair, or excessive, and react with resentment and a desire to test them. What do you think, guys? Ben, you ready to start us off? Sure, I'm David, and that's a great thought. I believe when it comes to being a recovering addict and walking with addict, that the way things are postured verbally is super important. If you say things like, here's your boundaries, or even don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that, suddenly we seem to feel like there are limitations set on us, which is, of course, what we need. But there's something within us that rises up and almost as a default wants to rebel, it seems. So, in my mind, the alternative to boundaries is finding another way to posture the thought, either verbally or by simply being a living example. That's why I personally like the thought of discipleship. Not necessarily using the word discipleship, because even that can run people off who have been burned by religion. But to me, it's the thought of as you go, literally just living a life of recovery and letting people walk with you and be with you as you live it out. Great start today, Ben. I really appreciate your understanding of that almost default nature that comes out of us to rebel against boundaries if we see them as limitations. And I do like that idea of as we go, just walking along and letting the people ask us questions as they be with us or live with us. Charlie, what do you think of this topic? David, as a certified recovery specialist, one of the things I do most is help support people in setting healthy boundaries. For someone in early recovery, it is very hard to get them to set healthy boundaries because they don't even know the definition of it in most cases. With emotional recovery being at the forefront in early recovery, I use that as my way to set healthy boundaries. So they're emotional boundaries, not necessarily behavior driven boundaries. And I do sort of 3 steps. Number 1, when a different emotion presents itself in a particular situation, I help the person identify the emotion, why they are not regulating that emotion in a healthy way, and then explain what a healthy boundary is and how they could apply it. Number 2, I ask them what they think would be important moving forward to work on emotional recovery. They typically say setting a healthy boundary with my mom, my work, or friends would be ways of helping. And then third, I reinforce their ideas. I say, great idea. Can I be an accountability partner with you in this? And I have great success here. The key for me in all of this is not to treat the individual as an addict. However, to treat them as a person who has a substance use disorder that has led to unhealthy behaviors and or medical problems that can be addressed. I've seen very little resentments, unfair comments, and negative reactions this way. Setting healthy boundaries is achievable for anyone, but it cannot be done alone. It takes help, and start with the person letting you in once they have a connection with their support person. Wow, I really like that 3-step approach that you've given there, Charlie, and I also like the focus on setting healthy emotional boundaries and start with an emotion that someone's dealing with, not a behavior that they're dealing with. Eddie, what do you think of this? David, I think your question is spot on. It's a true story. Setting healthy boundaries can be very hard for addicts, and they might even feel like they're unfair or even unhelpful. But that doesn't mean that you can do without them. It just means that they need to be set in a thoughtful and maybe even a kind way. Boundaries should protect both the addict and the people around them. Finding this balance can be tough, but important for recovery and relationships to keep both healthy. So well said, Eddie. That really reinforces something that I believe, that often when family members or loved ones want to set boundaries, it should be in a setting where you've got your counselor, your mentor, your sponsor, your coach, and you sit down with yourself and the person who wants to set the boundaries and the coach, and you work them out that way, because you really need to make sure that they're presented in a thoughtful and kind way, as you said. Dante, what do you think? David, with regards to boundaries, I think they do work. But yes, it took me some time to get to a place where I felt they were necessary. I feel like time and practice leads to experience, and that experience should lead to a greater level of maturity and then acceptance of some boundaries. But I personally have dealt with just simply feeling like I deserve it. I can do it anyways. It's not going to matter. I can do it this one time. No big deal. Who's it going to hurt? So there is still that pull away from the boundaries because of addiction, and then pulling away from the behavior of addiction, but also that pull to pull us back into it lingers on. And so I agree with that. Working the healthy balance is so important. And I found that I must work daily to remind myself what is important. What am I fighting for? What am I living for? And I come up with the same answer all the time: family, our life together. And in order to keep that on track and keep us focused on that journey and that destination. Wow. Well spoken, Dante. I appreciate your sharing there about that battle, that sort of tug of war in the beginning, where we have the lingering desire that says, I deserve it, battling against it, but I know I need to move away from it. Harry, what do you think? David, I personally feel the boundaries set by therapists and psychologists can be somewhat excessive, as many of these medical professionals have no practical experience in addictions or haven't walked down the path of addiction. I personally was counseled by a psychologist and found the boundaries set for me very excessive. And I did everything to test them and started manipulating others to stop my visits. But I was blessed to later find a psychologist who was, in fact, someone who had a 10-year addiction and then became a counselor. Meeting with her and having her relate to my addiction and everything I was going through made recovery much easier in the beginning. The boundaries she advised were things that helped her in recovery, and it was something I can relate to agree with setting those boundaries in my life. There was no need to test them because they were fair and reasonable. Wow. Well spoken there, Harry. I can see the importance of having someone who's walk the walk before help you set up those boundaries. So whether that's your counselor, your support group, whether it's your sponsor, your coach, it is important to have them involved in helping you identify boundaries and how to apply them and how to make sure they're fair and reasonable. Freddie, you ready to close this out today? Sure, David. My wife set some boundaries on me in early recovery that initially made me resentful towards her. She insisted on me getting a job, any part-time job. I was still quite a mess in early recovery, and I resisted this mandate out of fear and pride. My brain fog and acute withdrawal put me in victim mode, lacking in self-confidence and feeling restless, irritable, and discontent. Welcome to my early recovery. I was fearful of my capacity to work any job. Reluctantly, my search started, and retail seemed like a low-stress option. But having my own insurance brokerage for 22 years before this, I was fearful of what others would think of me having a lowly retail job. My pride was getting in the way. Well, long story short, I ended up working at the Nike outlet 4 years and now at the Hampton Inn for almost 5 years. Both of these jobs eventually gave me confidence, purpose, and some validation. Had my wife not insisted on me getting a job, I would have stayed in victim mode and may have easily relapsed. Wow. I like that look at it, and really haven't had anybody else come from that angle, Freddie, but I can see how just taking that step, the boundary can be an expectation saying, get a job. And it's going to bring up fear. It's going to bring up pride. It's going to bring up resentment, which could cause us to relapse. But also, if we don't follow through, we may relapse. Thanks, guys, for all your input, and thanks to all the listeners for catching this episode of the A to D from Addict to Disciple podcast. If you can identify with this, if you were saying, that's me, as you listen, then I want to urge you to reach out now and join a group. Find a coach, a sponsor, a support group, some support system that you can work on these healthy boundaries with. You can message me on the link in this podcast or by email at davidfromatod@gmail.com, or go to my website, www.froma2d.org, and click on the contact page. Keep listening to future podcast episodes, and as always, stay safe and stay resilient.